Thank you so much for joining today for our seventh and final webinar in this series, the Decodable Book webinar series. This one is called Decodable Books Supporting Dyslexia. I haven't really mentioned who I am or my background, and today I wanted to mention it to say that I've been an educator for a long time. I did start Express Readers almost a decade ago now, and I've been an advocate in this space um, in my own district. So I understand as a mom what a lot of us go through when special needs are involved or some kind of an obstacle that has come up. I'm a mom to two boys. My oldest is a struggling reader, and he is working through that. But I say all of this to help you understand where the desire to have this conversation is. I also want to say too that I am not a dyslexia expert. I'm heavily studied, but I do refer to the experts and the researchers on this topic, as you'll see in this webinar. I just wanted to be transparent from the very beginning. Um, let's talk really quickly about what dyslexia is. It's the most common reading disorder. It affects 15 to 20% of people, 13 to 14% of school age children, and according to the International Dyslexia Association. It's difficulty processing sound spellings and how to put them together into words. So basically, struggling to read and to spell. But it is neurological in origin, meaning it has to do with the brain. It is not an intelligence deficit. So previously, and although I know that there are still myths out there, prior to the at least the last decade, um, there was a misunderstanding that the children who had dyslexia or the people that were dyslexic were somehow less in the intelligent region. But what we're finding out is that not only are kids very smart, but oftentimes have, um, are in tune with certain portions of themselves and their capabilities. That being said, I'm not saying that it isn't incredibly difficult and frustrating, just saying it is not an intelligence deficit. It's not a problem of laziness. Often you'll see that these kids have to work twice as hard, whether it is to work to actually read or to mask it. So when it's not being attended to hide that fact or to look like they're reading. Um, it's not a lack of desire to read. Oftentimes, it's quite the opposite. But not being able to do something, sometimes it can turn you away from it. It's not a vision problem and it's not reading backwards. I know definitely when I started as a teacher, we always thought it was you were just flipping letters, but it is definitely not that as a definition. And it is not something that's outgrown. With explicit and systematic instruction, it can be attended to and children can successfully read and spell. However, it is neurological in origin, which means that technically it is a part of of your brain, and we know this too because we know that it is genetically passed down, um, as you'll see many times that if a child is dyslexic, their parents are as well, or one or both. Um, so knowing all of these things, what it is not, we need to walk away from the myths because we really need to start attending to what is going to help these kids, especially understanding how many of them. Not saying that any child should ever be neglected in their education or being taken care of, but just saying that we know so many of our kids are afflicted with dyslexia, and I, we want to make sure that we are aware, we are sensitive, and that we are attending the best we possibly can with or without the degree. Early identification is key. We very much understand now that you can identify dyslexia preschool, early kinder. It is not something as in the past we used to say, let's wait and see, or we can't attend to that until third or fourth grade. The sooner we catch it, the better chance we have with the early intervention of supporting our kids and helping them create those pathways or strengthen the connectivity in their brains so that they can be readers and spellers. Students with dyslexia can learn to read and spell. It does take explicit and direct and systematic and cumulative instruction, but it can happen. It, it obviously varies very much like on a spectrum of how much intensive instruction or how much extra support a child will need. But we do know that in a classroom with structured literacy, children are already taking the first step to being supported and being a reader. So, although our students with dyslexia will need more support, this is the very beginning. So, it's important to understand this when we advocate or when we look for schools or when we're approaching their basic instruction. So this is a very simplified version of what the strengths and obstacles can be for our readers. And what you'll see is that this word recognition process, so it's the reading and the spelling mechanics, these are the things that are obstacles for our children with dyslexia. It's something that is also an obstacle for our struggling readers. So it's all that much more reason that we look at this as an essential piece in our instruction in a gen ed classroom as well as in our intervention. I'll talk about it more later, but I referenced it before. This piece about dyslexia kids having great language processing, comprehension processing skills is very true. And we're starting to see how very smart and how very wrong we were, but how very smart our kids are. And it will also come into play later when our children are somewhat able to mask dyslexia or pass assessments or show as though they are reading when we are using the wrong materials. So, words, well, let me just say this way. I've used this graphic before. If you look at the one on the left, it's a very simplified version of what happens in the brain and the structures and the functions that are happening. But what you'll see in this picture by Nadine Gobb is that the typical brain has regions that are lighted up while kids are reading, where it's not necessarily happening in a dyslexic child. There are many reasons for this, and a lot of them, and I'll show you some of the research and I'll give you some of those links. There's many reasons for this, but it's very important to remember that we have to help the brain gain those new pathways, and it might take longer, which is why we talk about this repeated and very systematic cumulative instruction. Dr. Nadine Gobb is a brilliant researcher and scientist in the field. She focuses on developmental cognitive neuroscience, particularly in language-based learning disabilities. She's a Harvard Associate Professor of Education. And the reason I bring her up is because it's when you're looking for information to look for those people that are really on the edge of this, that are coming up with or finding or being involved with the most relevant and uh, most relevant and uh, applicable information. She is definitely one of them. One of the things, and I try not to use slides that have too many words on them, but this is is just such a poignant quote to be reading. Words learned through the letter sound instruction elicited neural activity biased toward the left side of the brain, which encompasses visual and language regions. In contrast, words learned via whole word association showed activity based towards right hemisphere processing. This strong left hemisphere engagement during early word recognition is a hallmark of skilled readers and is characteristically lacking in children and adults who are struggling with reading. I think it's very important to remember that there is a scientific basis for some of the information that we're finding now. Um, more recently, scientists have found that the brain activity isn't the only thing that differs, it's this connectivity. However, with systematic research-based reading instruction, we can normalize some brain functions, improving reading skills. And it it can be improved following that targeted instruction, as you see here in this picture. So, what many teachers and many parents are faced with is, why are these leveled readers not an effective practice space. I've gone over it before with why it's not an effective practice space, but I will say that it is more important during this conversation to really review that. And the reason being that when I showed you earlier, our kids with dyslexia oftentimes find ways around actually attending to the text because being smart and having context and being able to comprehend language, they can find those other ways. So when we provide them with books that allow for that guessing or even push for that guessing, that becomes the method that's the go-to. Leveled readers are this pattern readers, predictable text. They often rely heavily on the picture. They have a lot of sight words in them. As you'll see right here, a leveled A book, one word is decodable if you know the basic sound spellings of the alphabet, and yet it's a level A. You'll see here another level A. There's only one word on each page, but you'll see this predictable pattern or predictable and this pattern behind the text that allows kids to, or actually pushes them to look at the picture to figure out what that last word is, especially considering it is not decodable at a level A where a child would technically be age-wise and skill-wise. You'll see these books that have very cute pictures, but at a level A, chickens lay eggs, none of those words are decodable for that child. So you would really be relying on the picture. I give lots of examples, and the reason being, it's very easy as an educator now or somebody in the decodable book space to look at these books and think, wow, there are not decodable words in these books for where they're saying that a child should be. But that lack of decodability, it's not taken into account in the leveling. So again, where you see that you really do need to look at the picture. What do I mean by guessing, though? There are pieces to this guessing, and if you've heard about cueing, it was how we heavily relied on it as reading strategies. But these are the things to move away from. So, especially when you're reading with children at home or you are supporting a child in a one on one setting, these are the pieces to walk away from. Because, again, as I had stated earlier, this language comprehension piece can be very high in our kids with dyslexia. So they will be able to access these guessing strategy, maybe even more so, and they will lean on them more so than an average reader. Prior to kind of this wave of understanding that a lot of us are having now, we used picture power. We said, don't give up, try something, guess it, check the picture, see what you think, looking at the first letter. So all we had to do was look at the first letter and guess based on the other parts of information in that text. So the sentence or the picture. I'm going to show you the three basic ways just really quickly. Guessing based on the picture. Well, here's the sentence: I like to climb, right? Um, it would be very easy to look at that word climb, look at the picture, and think of things like hang, cling, cross. Those are great guesses for what's happening in this picture, but none of those are the actual word. Guessing based on the first letter of a word. So if we look at this, this is a calf. And I know I've seen this example somewhere, maybe using something else, but this is a calf. Look at this word calf. If we're basing on the first letter, my first guess might be to say this is a cow. But they're very different things, especially when we're trying to learn about baby animals. And guessing based on sentence meaning. So bear draws apples. None of these words are technically decodable for a child that knows the basic sound spellings. I might look at apples and I might say, Bear does art. That's not technically wrong. He is drawing, so he is doing art. I might look at chickens lay eggs and look at these cute little hearts up here and say, Chickens love eggs. In the past, we wouldn't necessarily correct a child, but now we're really starting to see that this becomes a habit for our kids, and it's why it's so important that we move away from it. How can, as we get to the real question, how can decodable books support our students with dyslexia? Well, I want to remind you that the most important piece of this is that decodable books are part of an instruction that is systematic and explicit and scaffolds, has the sound spellings that a child is learning. Basically, we want the sound spellings that a child is learning to then be used in the words that they're seeing and in the books that they are provided with. So, taking these handful of basic sounds, these would be the words that would then be decodable. This is so important, and I would argue to say it is more important for our kids, our dyslexic students, because um, decodable books help reinforce this need for practice alongside the instruction. So, if a child is learning one specific skill set, to practice it again and again and again, we want to be able to give them something that isn't dry or constantly repeated. So having a range of materials, but that all focus on this same skill set, because it's normal to need a lot of practice, even for our typical readers, but especially when we're looking at a child that is either struggling or has dyslexia. So here from the Laughing Ogre, this is a short A book. The focus is a short A. One thing that you might do is actually highlight the specific sound you're working on. So if these are your books at home, or if you have black and white copies, or even if this is your specialty working with kids with dyslexia, actually highlighting those sounds helps a child to map. And I'm going to go over that word map, but helps them to identify the sound spellings in a word easier, and show kind of shows their brain how to do it. Using this repetition, using the same sound spelling. So if you're working in CVC, finding multiple books, multiple series can create this sense of accomplishment. Um, I know that, and this is slightly different since my son is just a struggling reader, but there was a day he looked at me and he said, "So I can only read your books." And I definitely went right out and bought a couple more series, because no, we want our kids to feel successful with books in general. And the great part about decodable books is that you can find all of these sets that have a specific and very identified set of skills that's being practices or sound spellings. So these are the YouKan Decodable Books. Again, I'm showing you just this CVC layout where our kids are looking at words again and again and again that have that basic sound spelling, so that their practice, like when we looked at that 40 to 200 times, they're finding an interesting way to do it with different characters, with different story types, with different kinds of illustrations. Because, yes, we don't want them to guess based on the illustration, but we don't want them to feel like their books can't be as exciting as the books that the student next to them is reading. Um, Hopefully the student next to them is also reading decodable books, but we do know that in the days of yore, our decodable selection was very small and it was not very interesting. So by having all these series of really fun, funny books, then our kids can feel that sense of accomplishment. These are the dog on a log books. And again, like I was saying with the previous one, this is just a short A practice and it has the nasal A in it. So it's just another way to continue to show our kids how important this is. Again, identifying by actually highlighting the sound that you're focusing on in those words. Um, this is why we talk about decodable books and dyslexia. I've been in this decodable book space for about a decade now, and I've seen what this can do for our kiddos. By having multiple books, multiple types, but all within one skill set, our kids are given a chance to succeed. We're setting them up for that success. So it doesn't matter what series you're using, as long as it is something that is controlled, it practices what they already know. It doesn't add too much. It just adds what they're learning in that instructional period. But giving that multiple opportunities for success and finding what inspires your kids. So there has been this drive to say, well, learning isn't fun if we are doing it in this structured, systematic, explicit way. I have to disagree. There are so many different kinds of resources now that make this fun, and I'm hopeful that parents and educators through something like this webinar or other resources can find all these different series that can help support our kids. One thing that I do need to bring up is sight words, and the reason is, this is going to be the one big obstacle in our books because these basic sound spellings, if we're talking about just the very beginning, they're going to be words that either, like put here, has an irregular spelling that you doesn't say and it doesn't even say you. So it's an irregular for that spelling. But then we've also got the ones that they haven't come across. And in order to have an interesting story, a lot of the time there are a couple of these words. The great part about decodable books is that they often and should identify these words so that you can help beforehand. What we're trying to do is we're trying to help the process that's happening in the brain so that a child can map, and I'll show you what I mean by that, but a child can take the sounds that they're hearing and put it to the actual phonics that's happening in those words, whether it's regular or irregular. We're helping them map those words so that they can store it and have fast retrieval. Obviously, we've talked about the amount of times a child might need to practice to do this, but the more times we can give them that edge, the closer they are to that end game, which is to recognize quickly, to have fluency when they're reading and not stop at every single word and have to decode. Well, with these sight words, and I know that that phrase in general can elicit some feelings, sight word, because we're not asking kids to memorize. We are hoping that at some point they look at a word and they will decode it so quickly that it happens without even a blink of the eye. And so on sight they have decoded that word or retrieved it from their memory as being mapped in a certain way. um, with decodable books, again, so important to make sure that your kids are seeing the sound spellings that are new to them or that they're working on. Maybe we identify these beforehand. But again, it's this sight word piece that is going to be the obstacle. So, really being able to lay out those words, taking those words while a child, before they even read it, and showing them what is irregular about it. You'll see so many different types of ways to do this. Heart words, star words. I mean, whatever. We've got sticky words in our program. However it is, by mapping that sound, you're helping kids to automatically begin this process, what we call orthographic mapping. It's mapping a word by its sound spellings. And so we're helping our kids outside of them learning the basic phonics to do just that. Now, if you own these books or if you work with kids specifically that need this, I definitely do suggest actually putting some kind of notation in the book so that every time they see that word, you are discussing or it's reviewed what it is about that word that's either irregular or hasn't been learned yet. Because then we're helping our kids attach those sounds to the actual spellings. And again, practicing it multiple times in different ways. Eventually, we want them to know these words so quickly that they are able to automatically read them. And this fluency will allow kids um, to comprehend a text that they're doing. If you were to run a race, and this is one that I've used before, if you were to run a race, and let's say somebody said, you know what, I'm going to throw some hurdles in here, and you fell on every single hurdle, how likely would it be that you would get back up and do a really great job? Or that you would feel good about the race, or that you would feel good about yourself? These are the kinds of things that we think of when we think of sight words. And a lot of decodable book series have thought this through beforehand. So when we see it in the actual text, a great way is to single it out. And if you can, if these are your books or you have black and white versions, to actually put a notation on there so that the kids can see how that word is put together. Because again, we need this type of practice and it can be authentic. But by using a controlled text, we are ensuring that we're not throwing up too many obstacles for our kids. It's already frustrating. It's already hard for a child who is learning on a regular track. And so by doing this, we're helping our kiddos. So are there studies or information about the certain formats of books? This is an interesting one, because I know that, we talk about the font that's happening, or we do talk about the color of paper. Really, when we look at the actual studies that have come out, There isn't a definitive answer as to saying these do help. That being said, I don't want to discourage if a child finds it easier or an adult finds it easier to look at those letters, because we do need to take into account, obviously, each individual. But I don't think it's a necessary um, accommodation, eh, considering the research that's available. If we could have a magical way to make books be easier for our kids with dyslexia, or people with dyslexia, obviously we would, especially when it's our own child. But the only way to ensure that our kids have access to learning to read is by ensuring that their instruction is explicit, systematic, and that they have that space to practice in a cumulative and and connected way. There have been some studies about letter spacing. I think that the end result was 65% of people felt as though this made it easier for them. There was a more rapid approach to their reading because without the crowding, more than half of the people involved in the studies felt as though this helped. Um, I do believe no matter who the child is, that having the space to find the sound spellings that are within words is always going to be helpful to fluency. But there haven't been studies that have been um, large enough in size or clear enough in the result to say that this is true. But having that spacing between the lines and between the words, as a preference and as an educator in a gen ed classroom sometimes, um, and I say that just from where I am, that it helps our kids to track with their finger. It helps them to find the phonics that's in it. It gives easier access to the fluency by allowing for less of this crowding. Um, According to the British Dyslexia Association, they compiled some data on the subject of readable fonts. Again, there isn't an incredible amount of um, research done on this that has been definitive. However, I don't think it is harmful at all to look at some of these and ensure that your materials are either or your student is responding in a way that is positive or negative to these. One thing is this spacing between letters, because if you look at, like, this is just an example, the R and the N, sometimes when they come together, it looks like one letter. So by ensuring that there's a spacing between the letter and that there's spacing between the words so we can really look at what each one is as a separate entity. Looking at I, L, and the number 1 and making sure that your font has some kind of distinction between the 3. Looking at the letters, because as I said, it's not about reading things backwards, but it's giving a distinction to the different kinds of letters so that there is a way to tell them apart in a much clearer fashion. Um, some studies have shown that having the G that doesn't look like an 8 or the A that doesn't look like, well, like this. Although there have been people that have said that A then looks too close to an O. I think it's just being cognizant of what is affecting the specific individual and what seems to be helping them, but understanding that there might be something to what they're seeing, how crowded the page is, or what types of fonts you use. It's not about there being a magic wand where we can make it easier for our kids outside of providing them with the correct instruction, but it is being cognizant. And the last one was really having these strong ascenders and descenders. So like on an H, having the oh, sorry, and I forgot to do this. Sorry. Having the stick or the line be longer so that we're not confusing it with other letters. Having a larger font size, using 12 plus point, not using italics, it can cause the words to run together, and not using underline, it can make some letters appear as though others. Again, none of these are required or necessarily proven, although there have been anecdotal reports done it. But there are studies about preference, and it makes sense to check in with our students and our kids. There are a lot there's obviously a lot we still don't know about dyslexia. Because of it being neurological in origin, we're learning more and more as, we start to use functional MRIs and brain scanning and neuroimaging. But there are some things that are important because, um, like this bottom one, the brain anatomy, researchers aren't sure why some parts of the brain are different, but they do know that the brain anatomy changes when they get intensive reading instruction. So, as we learn more, it's important for us to really start to focus on what we do know. And we do know that with this intensive instruction, based around the sound spellings and the reading and spelling mechanics, we can drastically change it for our kids and our students. And home, or even, as a teacher, helping our kids, giving these strategies that really focus on the letters, the text, the actual um, words that are happening on the page, instead of pointing them towards guessing strategies that can easily, not easily, but somewhat easily be used to mask any difficulties that are happening. And I know I've said this story before, but my son in kindergarten was identified as being at a level C. Um, Not that I know necessarily what that means, but most kindergartners apparently are at a level C or D when they leave kindergarten. And yet, then came to find out that he really only knew a couple of letter sounds. So technically, he wasn't reading the words. This is what I mean by giving strategies that really tell our kids to focus on those words. Ensuring that you align your books to instruction. So if you know what's happening in their class or in their tutoring, or you are those people providing it, really making sure that what they're learning and what they've already learned is what they're being given in the books. So it doesn't matter where they are in the scope and sequence. What matters is that you are giving them a book that transparently only has the skills that that child has been learning or has learned, because this is the way we're going to help our kids be successful. Now, I'm going to spend a minute on this because I think it's so important to really focus on the fact that not only have we failed a lot of kids with dyslexia, or just struggling readers in general, there are a lot of kids now who are older, who are in classes where they're sitting next to somebody and they're having to pretend they can read the same kind of book so that they don't feel embarrassed. There are companies now, and I get this question a lot. Do you know of something for an older reader, something that's got high interest level, but that has a more basic phonics structure? Because it's really important to respect their intelligence and to help them to have a book just like their peers do, but while respecting what it is that they are learning and what they have learned prior. So this series, The Doggone Logbooks by Pamela Brooks, she really understands Decodable very much, so goes into the structures and makes sure that the books are controlled, and that all of the words follow the scope and sequence that she has laid out. She's taken a lot of care to do that. She has a page on her website that offers free resources about dyslexia. I am going to read to you. She wrote to me this morning and said, that this one, teaching a struggling reader one mom's experience with dyslexia, answers all the questions I wish I'd known to ask when we first suspected our daughter had dyslexia. To be honest, my life would have been a lot less worrisome if I'd had that book to read. Um, and I think that that's very important to hear from someone. It's also important to note that the author herself, has a connection to dyslexia. And so the books are written with a certain kind of care behind that. Um, So anyhow, then moving on to the phonics books, LTD, they have multiple kinds of series, a dandelion series, a magic belt series, this catch up series. The books, especially for the older readers, not saying that I don't love the younger ones, but for the older readers, look and feel like an older child's book. So and the storylines that are in them very much also respect the intelligence of a child. Um, the three authors of the series of all of these series were special needs teachers, and they have almost 300 books, but it's definitely worth looking into as you try to find the interest to help our kids love reading while they're still struggling with it. So just some options. Then Rex runs off. Larissa Phillips. I'm going to read you hers as well. She says, I'm a writer and editor who fell into the world of literacy 15 years ago and have been obsessed over since with trying to provide materials for beginning readers of all ages. I teach adults to read using a curriculum that's aligned to the science of reading. I am pro phonics and in favor of explicit teaching. I believe we need an all hands on deck effort to address the reading crisis in the US. My books, meaning Larissa Phillips, City Stories, and Rex Runs Off series offer decodable stories for new readers who are outside the typical learning paradigm. So by providing books that our kids, older students, adults can read at their level, but with the phonics structures that respect what they know. So they're carefully crafted. They look like older adult books or older readers. They're simple, they're clean, they've got the spacing. So she very much provides attention to the older reader. On the Megan Gregg series, because we I know, especially at home, we want to read with our kids or we want to give them the opportunity to read. This was an interesting series that I came across a while ago. It's this adult or body readers text and the kids text. So it is controlled as far as the phonics that are being used on the one side. It gives this shared experience to reading without requiring too much or, as we'll hear from Cigdem in a bit, this looking ahead to make sure that they don't have to read too much. It makes it fun for the shared reader experience. And then the Patent Pals, I hope Sue will forgive me because I probably mispronounced her name a couple of times. Marasciulo, she writes decodable graphic novels. And the reason I think this is important is because we're giving this fun interest level to kids or adults um, that have a more basic knowledge of the phonics. So it's a really neat series. Now, this last one that we're going to look at really quickly is the Simple Words books. Cigdem is a brilliant author, and I'm so excited to have you all hear from her. So I'm going to jump right into that.
Everyone, this is Cigdem Knebel. I'm the founder of Simple Words Books. Thank you, Elise, for inviting me to join you guys on this webinar from across the globe. I am a proud mom of two dyslexic kids, and I'm dyslexic myself. My husband is dyslexic as well. We were self-diagnosed after our kids were diagnosed, and being a neurodiverse family, we have a lot of personal experiences on how to navigate this neurodiverse world, along with, of course, now I'm writing decodable books and how these decodable books really helped my kids and so many other kids around the world. Our story started when my son was diagnosed at age 6 in first grade. By the time he was in second grade, his classmates were able to read big kid chapter books, and they were able to pick books from the shelf for quiet reading time, while he was stuck with the books that were in a basket, and they were all picture books. So soon he figured out that he could get books from the shelf and just sit for 20 minutes quietly and act like he was reading. And unfortunately, because 20 minutes was too long for him to sit still, he just started saying, "I don't like reading. I don't like books," which we know were not true because he loved being read to, and he really enjoyed stories and audiobooks as well. I want to start the discussion about decodable chapter books with a couple of things that I personally think are very important for these big kid chapter books to have. Number one is the scope and sequence. I think we have heard enough about it, so I'm not going to go into details about what scope and sequence is and the importance of it. My personal opinion is that all decodable books should include a scope and sequence. This way, the teacher or the parent can determine if the book matches what the reader can successfully decode. An analogy I often use about decodable books is going to the gym for a workout. If the workout is too weak or too heavy, we don't get the best result. If we push ourselves with too heavy weights, we get injured. And if the weights are too weak, then we don't get the growth that we desire. So if we progressively lift heavier weights with repetition, that's where the growth happens. Just also remember that when one has positive experiences, they will be more willing to continue pursuing that task. And reading is no different. In desperation, I began writing decodable big kid chapter books to provide my son books that would give him positive experiences and books that he could proudly read while he's also practicing his fluency. My books are about 4,000 to 8,000 plus words. And at this length, it's very important that the authors start making very few exceptions because with this many words, if there are a few exceptions on each page, it really adds up and compiles really fast. Therefore, in my opinion, decodability, especially for the longer chapter books, is really critical. These longer books also may look intimidated because most of these striving readers have already had negative experiences trying to read traditional chapter books. Therefore, even a few difficult words on each page could discourage them faster. The feedback we get from our readers, and parents and teachers, is that most of our readers that finish the first about 10 pages of our book, the first simple words books they read, they successfully complete the book and ask for their next chapter book. And that's also important because that again gives that positive feedback that they were successfully able to read a book and now they have the encouragement to read the next book. Another thing that I have noticed is when dyslexic readers or striving readers are starting to read, they want to feel comfortable with what they see on the page. I'm not talking about just the words, but the format of the book. So the sentences and paragraphs and chapters should be short. For example, when my son and I were taking turns reading a paragraph each, and if there was a long paragraph ahead, he would stop listening to what I was reading and count the paragraphs to figure out whether he would read that long paragraph or not. And if he had to, then he would start negotiating while I'm trying to read to make sure that he did not end up reading that long paragraph. So for chapters, we had a similar experience. Reading one chapter feels like a great accomplishment, but if the chapter is too long, then it may become discouraging right from the start. As a dyslexic myself, I still look how long a chapter is when I'm reading a book today. And I saw that my son did the same as a second grader. So I knew that each chapter had to be emotionally manageable as well. And as you can see, as I continued writing, my later books are mostly around like 20 to 30 chapters versus the earlier books had fewer chapters. I think it's important to know how to use decodable books at home. With a beginner reader, if a word is decodable, but the reader is stuck, I would suggest that you ask them to tap the word, not guessing the word or cluing the text from the illustrations. This is why I prefer decodable books that don't have illustration at our level, because they could be used as a clue and distract the decoding efforts and habits. Uh, Remind them to slow down and to decode again if they're stuck on a word, and point out the words if necessary. Reread the word and then the sentence if the reading lacks fluency, and this would help with comprehension. Explain vocabulary where needed. Most chapter books at these levels are able to use a little bit more trickier vocabulary and also words that might mean several different things. So it's a great place to take a moment to explain the vocabulary and maybe even compare what each meaning of the word was. Ask questions about the story to confirm the reader comprehended the meaning behind the text. To build stamina, start slow and short and gradually improve upon it. This may mean a few sentences, even possibly taking turns when reading. And then making it a paragraph, a page, a chapter. It's also helpful to break a long reading into smaller chunks and take some breaks in between if needed. This builds reading stamina. You can also take turns, as I said. For example, you can read one sentence or a paragraph or a page, and then they take turns for the reader to read a similar amount. Asking the reader to summarize a story in a few sentences, every few pages or every few chapters is helpful to confirm that they understand what is read. Connect with the story by encouraging the reader to connect to the characters or the events that are happening in his own words. And by engaging with the story and discussing the feelings, thoughts, and actions of the characters would help the context to stick. Also, review the topic and predict the story. It's always a great idea to learn more facts about the context and supporting topics about the story. And for example, if you're reading about the Native Americans, you can learn about their culture, their history. This helps them capture deeper meanings and connections in the text. Set a daily routine and preferably read every day, even if it's only a few sentences or a few minutes. It helps to set the target and expectations for the practice before starting to read. As they get stronger, you can let them read longer and eventually independently without taking turns. Always approach reading with kindness and make reading fun. Cuddle under a blanket, build a fort, a tent, read at the swings, read to a younger sibling, a pet, or a stuffed animal, and if possible, instead of making it a chore, make it a leisure activity. A couple of last items before I wrap up for today is, as I said, it's the emotional side is very important, and we on our website have a certificate of accomplishment, and each of our books have this at the back as well. You can cut it, you can fill the reader's name. I think it's very important to have these celebrations, especially at home as parents, because it's for them it is a big accomplishment, and it is very important to make reading a positive experience for these young striving readers, so that they have more beliefs in themselves, that they can read and that this is fun, and this really could last a lifetime. The love of reading, love of learning, and where possible, try to find, especially the first books they read, to be the topics that they enjoy. We try very hard to make sure that we include as many genres as we can. For example, at our novice level, which is an 11-book series, we have adventure books, Sam Stuck, Fox Hunt, Back to the Past, and The Gold of Black Rock Hill. For example, Back to the Past is about dinosaurs. The Gold of Black Rock Hill is about pirates. Fox Hunt and Sam Stuck about animals. And we have a spelling pan series, 3 books in that series as of now. Spelling pan in Elfland, Red Obelisk, and Brass Lamp. It's a fantasy. We have detective fiction, where the book is King's Ring, where they can the 2 kids who go on a class trip solve a mystery about a ring stolen at a display at a museum. And then we have The Last Task and 6 Days at Camp, 2 titles there, one for girls, one for boys, are realistic fiction. We are currently working on our sci-fi trilogy. Any of these genres is of interest, try to pick the ones that are, again, the most importantly is the right level, that they have learned the phonics rules that are included in the book, but then what interests them. And this would help them also build vocabulary in the areas that they are interested in, and have probably a lot more interest to open up the book and can start reading. In our books, we also believe that we should be using it where, as much as possible, gender neutral heroes. All of our books have a male and a female lead character. They could be animals, they could be, you know, humans, but we always try to make sure that the top two characters is a male and a female. So this is all I have for today. If you want to learn more about Simple Words Books, you can go to simplewordsbooks.com. For our scope and sequence, you can go to simplewordsbooks.com /scope. And here you can also find a sample chapter for each of our titles. And if you want to reach me directly for any questions and any support as parents or as teachers, you can email me at Knebel, Knebel @simplewordsbooks.com. Enjoy your webinar series. Bye bye.
Oh, I'm gonna go back one. So thank you to Cheatham for doing that. She has her words are strong because of her experience, but also what she's put into her books. I do want to say thank you to all of the publishers that were involved with this series and with this one specifically. There's some really great series out there, and I hope you'll have time to look into them. This page will be live by tomorrow. So we'll have a page where you can take the test or you can download any of the files that we provided here. It's found on our website. Please make sure you get a free sample of our hard copy books because we always do that on our Decodables page, or you can scan here to get them. And I will just at the very end to say, I will be giving a list of the resources that were used here today. So thank you so very much for joining us, and I hope you have a lovely day.